Hi, this is Ben Hart. I'm sitting out here on the porch right now. My wife Wanda is in bed. So are the neighbors. All I can hear now is an occasional dog barking and the crickets. So I'm going to use this opportunity to give you some information that you will hear almost nowhere else. I'm going to talk to you about how all of our political freedoms basically come from Christianity, and specifically come from Puritan theology. The narrative that we've been hearing from the secularist left for the last half century or so is that religious faith, and Christianity in particular, is somehow a threat to liberty. The liberal history lesson is basically this: America achieved liberty by throwing off the oppressive chains of religious faith. The less important religion became, the freer we became. That's the liberal history lesson. To support this myth, liberals constantly remind us of the sins of our Christian past. We constantly hear about the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, the Salem witch trials, as if these episodes represent the essence of Christianity. The lesson we're supposed to learn from focusing on the worst moments in Christian history is that as faith faded more and more into the background, man was able to free himself from the chains of religion, free himself from religious bondage. Never mind that the worst examples of genocide and Holocaust occurred under secular ideologies, such as communism and Nazism. The Salem witch trials didn't represent the truth of Christianity any more than the new Black Panthers represent Black Americans. The truth is that Christianity, far from being an enemy of liberty, is in fact the source of just about all of our political freedoms, is the source of just about all of our civil liberties. Most of all, America is the product of Puritan theology. In fact, our entire political system, our constitutional representative republic, is pretty close to a carbon copy of the Presbyterian church structure of the 17th century. That's right. Our entire constitutional political system is an outgrowth, a product of 17th century Puritan theology, especially the version that took root in Puritan New England. The Puritans, for example, are the source of America's free enterprise system, what Max Weber called the Protestant spirit of capitalism. The Puritans are also the source of separation of powers and divided government, because of their belief that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. They believed in original sin, the idea that human nature is corrupt, and that when you give people too much power, that will inevitably result in tyranny. The Puritans put an end to the divine right of kings. The Puritans invented the secret ballot. You have no doubt heard of the Protestant work ethic. You can't have capitalism without a work ethic. The Puritans made the work ethic, the Protestant work ethic, famous. The Puritans were the source of charters of liberties. The Mayflower Compact was the precursor to our Bill of Rights. Puritanism is even the originator of the separation of church and state principle. Church officials in Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay in the 17th century were barred by law from holding political office. And by the way, the commonly held stereotype of the Puritans as being puritanical is absolutely and completely false. The Puritans, far from being anti-sex and anti-fun, were famous for their feasts, their celebrations, their music and dances. They were famous for building huge rum and tobacco enterprises, products that they sold worldwide with state-of-the-science commercial ships that they built in New England. The Puritans were like many of us who sometimes have a drink too many. They also enjoyed wearing colorful and festive clothing. The anti-Christian, anti-freedom left loves to cite the Salem witch trials as an example of Puritan intolerance. But this bizarre event, which occurred in a small backwater village, was an aberration in the history of Puritanism in America, and had far more to do with political corruption by a few power-mad government officials than any inherent problem with the general spirit of Puritanism, which actually cherished liberty and tolerance. The Puritans were really the originators of the principle of religious freedom. The Puritans always got along well with the Indians and were famous for their hospitality and generosity. The Puritans and the Indians often feasted together and learned each other's music and customs. Liberals loved the French Revolution and often tried to cast the French Revolution and the American Revolution as coming from the same Enlightenment intellectual strain in France, the French Enlightenment. But the two revolutions could not be more different. They were polar opposite revolutions in just about every respect. The anti-Christian French Revolution produced Robespierre and Napoleon. The anti-Christian French Revolution produced tyranny. Now, that's not to say that the French Revolution didn't have a few good points. The French Revolution was driven by a hatred of corrupt government and a corrupt church. Anyone who has been to Versailles, just outside Paris, can certainly see why there was a revolution against this kind of corruption and excess. But revolutions that are driven primarily by hatred, primarily by opposition to something, no matter how justified, rarely produce something good. One form of tyranny is almost always replaced by another form of tyranny, often worse than the first. The czars in Russia were bad, but they were replaced by the communists, by Lenin, by Stalin. Mao Zedong was not an improvement in China. What made the American Revolution different and unique is that it was grounded in Puritan theology. The case for liberty outlined in the American Declaration of Independence is a religious argument. Mainly, it was a Puritan argument. The Declaration of Independence says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." What I aim to do here with this lecture is to go into a little depth in correcting what I call the liberal history lesson. For example, the ACLU, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, People for the American Way, and the radical secularist left argue that government can take no religious position whatsoever, that government should be neutral on religion, completely neutral. And they cite the so-called separation of church and state principle to support their position. Never mind that separation of church and state appears nowhere in our Constitution and nowhere in Americans' founding documents. It's not in our Constitution, it's not in the Declaration of Independence, it's nowhere. What the Constitution does say, in the so-called religion clause of the First Amendment, is this, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." So the separation of church and state principle is embedded in the religious clause of the First Amendment. But what does the religion clause actually say? What does this separation of church and state idea, what did it mean in the minds of our founding fathers? Well, let's read this again. Let's read the First Amendment, the religion clause of the First Amendment again. It says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." All this is saying is that there can be no official national church, such as the Anglican Church in England. That's what separation of church and state meant to America's founding fathers. We had just fought a revolution, the American Revolution, in part to get out from under the Anglican Church, which was just a corrupt political arm of the King of England. The Pilgrims and the Puritans had fled England in the 17th century for the shores of America, in large part to get away from persecution by a corrupt Anglican Church in England, which was an arm of the state, an arm of the king. The king saw the Puritans and the Protestant separatists who were rebelling against the Church of England as a political enemy of the king. Again, the idea that church and state should be separate was a Puritan idea. Because of their experience with this corrupt, politicized Anglican Church in England, the Pilgrims of Plymouth Rock and the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay actually made it illegal for ministers to hold government office. You couldn't run for office if you were a minister or a church official. The reason they did that was because of their experience that combining church and state ultimately corrupted the church. But that most certainly does not mean that the governments of Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth had no religious perspective. Far from it. In fact, you were required by law to be in church on the Lord's Day. So this separation of church and state principle actually originated with the ultra-religious Pilgrims and Puritans who had fled the corrupt state-run church in England to America, where they would be free to practice a more pure form of Christianity.